So I guess I'm coming at this from a different way of working with granite now. So my background is I trained as a geologist, and my PhD and then my research afterwards was all focused on the granites of southwest England. And I was looking at kind of how they evolved and how they came to be like as they are now, their different textures, looking at their chemistry, their different minerals, and trying to work out kind of what that meant for different types of mineralisation across southwest England. And I'm actually whilst I still work on this a little bit in my spare time with a colleague at Cornwall School of Mines, I actually work in the humanitarian sector, so I intersect with geology now in a very different way. So mostly kind of earthquakes and bad things happening around the world. But today I'm really going to focus on the variety of granites that we have in southwest England and why, and hopefully just lots of pictures. And I've put some of these samples out in the corridor so you can have a look whenever you have time. So I thought I'd start with something really boring, hopefully not too boring, but we have a scientific definition of what a granite is. So we talk about granite in science, and we have to define all our different rock types. And a granite, to a scientist or a geologist, is a hard crystalline felsic, so that means it's got a lot of silica. It's an igneous rock, so it comes from a melt. And it is comprised mostly of three minerals, so quartz, alkali feldspar and plagioclase feldspar. And we must have those three minerals for it to really truly be called a granite. And they're roughly in kind of equal proportions, although we do see a bit of variation in different types of granite around the world. And we have lots of other minerals. So we'll talk about in Cornwall, we have lots of mica and we have a lot of tourmaline. But in different granites around the world, we can also have amphiboles, hornblends, all kinds of different minerals. But as long as we've got those three, then we've got ourselves a granite. So I hope that makes sense. And we've been looking today, this classic Cornish granite, so we can pick out our main minerals. I've forgotten to label the plagioclase, very sorry about that. But we can pick out our white alkali feldspars, we can pick out our kind of slightly grey quartzes, and we have our kind of flaky, shiny biotite and muscovite micas. And then unique to Cornwall, as Ruth has said, well, not unique to Cornwall, but I guess characteristic of Cornwall, as Ruth was talking about earlier, we have a lot of tourmaline. So these black kind of laths that you find within the granites across the whole of southwest England, so you can see them kind of here, these things here. And that's something that's very distinctive to us in southwest England. But how do they form? So this is the kind of dynamic planet part, I guess, of the talk. We can make granites all over the world in lots of different settings. So I think Ruth, we were talking earlier about tectonic plates doing different things. So we can make granites in all these different places. So where we have an ocean going under another ocean, we can melt something and we can make a granite. So somewhere like the Antilles, for example. Where we have an ocean going under a continent, we can melt something and make a granitic rock. So somewhere like the Andes. I'll come back to the two in circles in a minute. Where we have two bits of continental crust pulling apart and we're getting heat rising up from deep within the earth, we can make granite. So somewhere like Yellowstone. And we also see the same, although it's not quite as common, somewhere like Iceland, where you've got oceanic plates pulling apart, you can get upwelling and you can melt and make something that's very similar to a granite again. What's important in Cornwall is how we made our granites here. So around 330 million years ago, we were part of an ancient mountain chain where we pushed together two continental plates. So a bit like this, a bit like the modern day Himalayas. And when we did that, we generated so much heat in our crust that we started melting down, way below the surface, and we started generating our melt. And through time, once you've made your mountains, they don't keep growing forever, they might start collapsing back again. So you had something like this, and they start extending apart. And this, like kind of the tectonic forces, we've talked about granite being sticky today. It's a bit like ketchup in a bottle, you need to like shake it out. So once you do that, it started rising up through the crust. And that's how we managed to get our granites kind of in place. And that happened about 305 million years ago. So that's how we need these big processes to make our granites. Kind of some of the most dynamic processes on Earth, I guess. So I hope that makes sense. But we'll just bear that in mind as we carry on throughout the talk. Okay, so probably a familiar map. But here we have lovely southwest England. I hope no one's from Devon. I'm only joking. But we have a whole series of granites, as we talked about at the start of the walk today, that extend all the way from Dartmoor all the way to the Isles of Scilly, and these are all connected at depth. So we know that going from Dartmoor to the Isles of Scilly, there's granite running the whole way. So there's an awful lot of granite in southwest England. And these are intruded into our Devonian, so the kind of yellow and brown carboniferous sedimentary rocks, so our Archillus. And a lot of people might look at a map of this, like this, and think, oh, granite, it's just a granite, they're all the same, they're all red. But actually, if we look a little bit closer at the granites, they're incredibly variable. So this is part of my PhD, involved over 3 years going to an awful lot of quarries from Dartmoor all the way to the Isles of Scilly, lots of coastal exposures, working with granite in a very different way. Today, I think I still had a hammer and chisel, but a bag with lots of paperwork with the permission that I could be there doing such a thing on Dartmoor. So wandering around, hammering off bits of rock, visiting lots of old quarries, including some that my family used to work down in Penwith. We worked to kind of map the granites of southwest England using a lot of different techniques. And you can subdivide them roughly into 5 types, and I'll talk through more what they look like in a minute. But we have a kind of early phase, and these kind of blue and grey ones that we can see. These are our 2 mica and our muscovite granites. So we've seen today lots of Carmenellis granite down and around Helston. That's very similar to the Isles of Scilly, to Bodmin, the St Agnes granite, for example. And then these are all linked to these small stocks, what we call a stock. It's like a small granite body, so like Hemerdon, Kit Hill, Hinxton Down, Cligger and Carmarth. And these are all much older, and I'll talk about why they're different in a minute. And then we have another second batch of granites that are a bit younger. So we've got the absolute monster that is Dartmoor. This is a huge granite body. It's quite unusual to have a granite body that's this big, and it's really deep. It's been mapped at being about 12 kilometres on the eastern side. It's huge. So Dartmoor, St Austell and Land's End, they all have this biotite granite and these tourmaline granites. They're a different type of granite. And then we've got the little green ones, which they are my favourite ones because they're so unusual and just a very interesting from a scientific perspective, down Tregonning Godolphin, little bits around St Austell, and a tiny little one just above Dartmoor. So that's kind of the variation on a broad scale. Should we say when we go through, we'll see some pictures. The granites actually vary down to the sub-metre scale. I can't show it on a map of that scale, but if we just bear in mind that when we're looking at a granite, if it's my height, it could have like 3 different types of granite and 3 different textures in it. It's incredibly variable. So I thought I'd just do lots of pictures basically. This is probably the best way to talk about the granites. So these are our kind of oldest ones. We've been looking at these a lot today. Hopefully they look familiar. This one on the far left is Carnsue Quarry. So we've probably seen a fair amount of that today, walking around. But they tend to be older than about 282 million years old, up to about 295 million years. We go from coarse-grained. They're all the same scale. All the 10 mil is the same on all photos. So they go from coarse-grained, hopefully you can see, to fine-grained here, like very different textures. They quite often have these alkali feldspar phenocrysts. Sometimes they look like rectangles, sometimes they're a bit more rounded, and they kind of vary in size and abundance. And again, they have a similar mineralogy, so they have both types of, like that shiny platy mineral that you see, the biotite and the muscovite, and they have a lot of tourmaline, but also things like andalusite and zircon and monazite, which were the radioactive minerals that Ruth was talking about earlier that kind of might create a few radon problems in southwest England. So where do you find these? Some pictures. David's spoken about Delank. That's kind of classically in a sort of medium grain 2 mica granite. And Cheesering, I'm glad you've mentioned all these places because you've got photos of them now. Cheesering, it's absolutely beautiful location if you've never been, up on Dartmoor. Bodmin Moor, again is in a 2 mica granite. If you ever climb up Carnbray, 2 mica granite, but slightly coarser than Delank or Cheesering. And Isles of Scilly, someone said they're going on holiday here quite soon. Was that you? Yeah, Monday. Northern edge of Briar and St Martin's, incredible. You can find all of them. So you can find the fine grained, the medium grained, and the coarse grained all together. And that is because that northern edge of the Isles of Scilly lies along an ancient fault. So that is one of the conduits through which the granite was entering higher levels in the crust. So you have lots of different types of granite all in one place. So it's really beautiful. I don't think the Agapanthus will be out though. unfortunately. So, sorry about that. And these granites, these two microgranites, they're linked by chemistry and by age and by mineralogy to muscovite granites. So these are the little grey blobs that we had on the map a minute ago. And again, they're medium to coarse grained. So medium on the far end. It's a bit coarser grained here. We don't tend to find fine grained versions of these so much. And they've got a very similar texture, and you might look at that and think, oh, that doesn't look particularly any different. But actually they are different. They have a different chemistry. They have more muscovite of the silver mica and less of the dark mica. And what's important about these rocks is that whilst they still have tourmaline and the micas, they have topaz and fluorite, and they've got an unusual chemistry. And it means that often these granites, they're linked to tungsten deposits. So you'll find this at Hemerdon. St Michael's Mount's got a tungsten deposit. They will probably never ever mine because it's got castle on it. Cligger, for example, has also got a tungsten deposit. So these are quite important to understand where we might find different metals in southwest England. So I've just kind of mentioned these three, but Hemerdon, David, you mentioned where they mine tungsten. Yeah. So this is Hemerdon. I think this was back in 2013, actually, before the mine got going the first time round. It's back open again. But that is a muscovite granite. St Michael's Mount, if you're ever lucky enough to get access around the other side, it's got a beautiful tungsten deposit and a very beautiful muscovite granite. And this is Cligger, so this is St Agnes, so it's very close to where I grew up in Trevellis and where I live now. This bit on the end is like quite fresh muscovite granite, and then we move through this huge stretch of mineralisation all the way down, and we've got Elvens down at this far end. So again, this is another muscovite granite. And then we move, we sort of have a little bit pause in our granite, making our granite and moving it into our crust. And then we come to a kind of slightly later phase of granite. And the reason we think this happened is because when I was talking about that mountain building event, we kind of started melting our crust, and then we started stretching it apart again. As we were stretching it apart, more and more like heat and like energy was welling up from deep within the earth at a much higher temperature, and this caused a later phase of higher temperature melting. And this is what generated, we think, some of our younger granites. So these are our biotite granites. They have a different chemistry, a different mineralogy, and because we've dated them, we know that they are this younger phase of granite. So again, we go from kind of, I've not put these in a very good order, but we kind of go from fine to kind of coarser grained again. And this time the feldspars are really different. So if you were to walk around Helston and you can look at the feldspars, they tend to be sort of 25, 30 mil maybe. When you're looking at the biotite granites, the feldspars are absolutely huge. So this one on the end is probably the size of the palm of my hand at Nungisel. They're really big. And these ones, this is a compass that's probably 15 centimetres high. So some of these are really huge. And these are really good granites if you ever want to go and look for the white cross that David was talking about, that you find a lot of white crosses in this type of granite. And this is Lumona Granite here. So these again are like 10, 15 centimetres sized alkali feldspars. And this is what kind of marks these granites out as being very, very different to the Carmenellis granite, for example. So if you're looking at a building and you see loads of these big feldspars, if it's in Helston, I doubt the granite has come from the Carmenellis. It's probably come from down Land's End way. And these are quite different as well mineralogically. They still have mica, but it's mostly biotite mica, so the dark mica. It has less of that silver mica. So they tend to be a much darker colour, and the quartz is much greyer. And there's a couple in the cabinet outside, so you can have a look and see. I haven't got too many with the big feldspars, because when you're a scientist, you're trying to get representative samples of these rocks. You need to try and get like probably 5 to 10 kilos sample size to try and get something that's representative to then crush and melt and analyse. They're quite challenging to work with. So a few places you can find these. Dartmoor, absolutely loads of this kind of granite. So Hound Tor, if you're ever up there, or Foggin Tor quarries, sort of around Princeton Way. There's an awful lot of this kind of granite up there. Nungisel at Land's End, really interesting place to go because you can find not only the coarse grain variants with loads and loads of the alkali feldspars, but also medium grain variants with fewer feldspars. So it's a really good place to look at the variation. And next time you're down at the Minack, you're sitting in something carved out of biotite granite. And actually my granddad worked on some of the balustrades, so I always like to tell that story and just put that photo in. So like with a little bit of pride there. You know, he was a stonemason too, but yeah. So lots of places you can find those. And these are linked, so you find the biotite granites, and they're spatially associated with these tourmaline granites, so they often occur together. So again, you're finding them in Land's End, St Austell and Dartmoor granites. And these are really interesting. They are quite, have a lot of textural variation, and there was really good work done in the kind of late 80s through to the mid 90s, whilst the China clay was like at its super peak, by people mapping in the pits all of the different variation of the granites. So we can get textures like this one, which are very similar to our like Carmenellus granite or something, but the chemistry is completely different, and they have very lithium-rich micas that are a slightly different colour. They're slightly pale browner. There's a lot of variation in the chemistry of these compared to our Carmenellus granite. We have these kind of like equigranular, we would call this. So a lot of the minerals look roughly the same size. It looks kind of like sugar almost, with little flecks of tourmaline in it. So that's a very different kind of texture. And then we have these. This is Carndine down at Land's End. So I don't know if you can see, there are these like grey rounded minerals here. These are quartzes, and they're always round. And when you look at them in a thin section under a microscope, they almost look like tree rings. They've got like inclusions of different other minerals in them as they kind of grow. And so we call that the globular quartz variant. But what marks these out is that they've got less mica and they have more tourmaline. So they're actually harder. I used to hate sampling them because it would take me so long to hammer them off, because the tourmaline is quite hard. I don't know if, David, you find that with something more tourmaline. But yeah, really challenging to sample, and an absolute nightmare to try and melt in the lab and get through the machines. Yeah, really hard work, but incredibly variable. And you can find that variation on a sort of sub-metre scale, as I've mentioned before. Very interesting type of granite. So where can you find these? I've sort of said clay country, absolutely everywhere in the clay country. It's where a lot of the original kind of science on them was done. Just north of Ivy Bridge on Dartmoor, that was something that during my research we found there was a whole load of tourmaline granites there that were previously unmapped. And if you ever happen to go to Cape Cornwall, on one side you've got Priest or Priest Cove, and on the other side you've got Porthleddon. That is a spectacular location to find about 10 different granite types within a very short sort of stretch of coast. But there are various types of tourmaline granite that you can find across those two beaches. Then on to the final granite type. So these are my absolute favourites because they are so weird, and I quite like them. They're like the outliers of the Cornubian batholith, so they're really interesting. So these are the Topaz Granites, and they look very different. They're quite equigranular, so everything's very similar size. They look quite sugary again, I guess, and they have very light brown micas. And if you've read anything about the lithium mining around St Austell, it's this granite type that they're targeting, because this is the one that's full of lithium. And they have quite an unusual chemistry, which means that they have a really unusual mineralogy, because you need your building blocks of chemistry, like your ingredients, to make your cake, effectively, to make your minerals. So they have tourmaline, but it's a very lithium-rich tourmaline. And if you go down to somewhere like Magilliga Rocks, near here, you can find absolutely beautiful watermelon tourmalines. So they're green on one end. So I've got green tourmaline in this thing here, which if you've never seen a green tourmaline, let me know. So they're green on one end and pink on the other. So they're quite unusual. And they have lots of strange phosphate minerals that you wouldn't necessarily always find in a granite. Things like amblygonite, something called amblygonite, which is quite unusual. And these globally are unusual, and no one's really come to a consensus in science as to how they form. There's lots of different theories. So they're quite odd. They move in quite strange ways. They're sort of quite sticky, but at the same time have a lot of fluid in them, as Ruth was talking about earlier with the water. So they've got quite strange properties. But we'll come back to these at the end. Because they are beautiful. But the variation doesn't stop at the granite types. So we've got our 5 main granite types, and then we've got all manner of textures. And I'm just going to share a few now because I think when you walk around looking at buildings, you can pick out some of these textures. So we've spoken about the granites being quite sticky. Top left, that is a bit of granite on the Isles of Scilly that's almost all made of these alkali